Please don't mind me. I am just here to tell stories. Just press the like button and let's begin.
It was supposed to be a quiet weekend. My parents were out of town, attending some distant relative's wedding that I had successfully weaseled my way out of. I was 17, almost 18, and more than capable of taking care of myself for a couple of days. Or so I thought. The first night alone was blissful. I ordered pizza, watched horror movies until I fell asleep on the couch, and reveled in the freedom of having the house to myself. I didn't have to worry about my dad's nagging or my mom's hovering. It was just me and the echo of silence in our big, creaky house. The second night, however, was when things started to get strange. I woke up around 2 a.m., needing a glass of water. Groggy and half asleep, I stumbled to the kitchen, flicking on the light. That's when I noticed the back door was slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it before going to bed, but maybe I was mistaken. I shrugged it off, blaming my sleepy brain, and closed it firmly before heading back to bed. The next morning, I found my keys on the floor in the hallway. I distinctly remembered leaving them on the kitchen counter. A small chill ran down my spine, but I quickly brushed it off. Maybe I had dropped them without noticing. It was an old house after all, and things had a tendency to shift and move in strange ways. That evening, I double-checked all the locks before settling in for another night of horror movies. Around midnight, I heard a noise. It was faint at first, almost like a whisper, but it grew louder and more insistent. It was coming from the basement. Every horror movie I had ever watched screamed at me not to go down there, but curiosity and a sense of obligation propelled me forward. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly made my way down the creaky wooden steps. The air was musty, filled with the scent of damp concrete and old memories. I shone the flashlight around the room, the beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing seemed out of place. Boxes of old Christmas decorations, an ancient washing machine, and miscellaneous junk were all accounted for. Just as I was about to head back upstairs, the light flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. My heart pounded in my chest as I fumbled for the light switch. I found it and flipped it on, but nothing happened. The power was out. Great! I hurried back upstairs, feeling the weight of the darkness pressing down on me. I lit a few candles and tried to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. The rest of the night passed without incident, but I barely slept, my mind replaying the events over and over. The next day, I called my parents. I didn't want to worry them, but I needed to hear a familiar voice. They assured me everything was fine and that they'd be back the next day. That brought some comfort, but the unease lingered. That night I was determined to sleep in my room. I locked the doors and windows, checked them twice, and finally settled into bed with my phone in hand. Scrolling through social media was a welcome distraction until I heard it again, the whispering. This time it was closer, coming from just outside my bedroom door. I froze, listening intently. The whispers were unintelligible, a low murmur of words I couldn't make out. Slowly I got out of bed and tiptoed to the door. My hand shook as I reached for the doorknob. I took a deep breath and yanked the door open, shining my phone's flashlight into the hallway. Nothing. The hallway was empty. I decided I had had enough. I was going to stay up all night, lights on, and wait for my parents to come home in the morning. I grabbed a baseball bat from the closet, just in case, and settled in on the couch with all the lights blazing. Around 3 a.m., I heard a soft creak. My heart skipped a beat as I realized it was the sound of someone walking on the wooden floorboards in the hallway. I tightened my grip on the bat and stood up, every muscle in my body tensed. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, getting closer and closer. I held my breath, the adrenaline coursing through my veins. As the footsteps reached the living room entrance, the lights flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. I swung the bat wildly in the direction of the footsteps, but hit nothing but air. Panic set in as I backed into a corner, clutching the bat like a lifeline. The whispering started again, this time right next to my ear. I could feel the cold breath on my neck. I screamed and swung the bat again, hitting the wall and sending a painful jolt up my arms. The whispering stopped, and the room fell silent once more. I fumbled for my phone, hands shaking, and turned on the flashlight. The room was empty. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat in the corner, bat in hand, flashlight trained on the doorway. As dawn broke, I finally felt a sense of relief. My parents would be home soon. When they arrived, I practically ran into their arms, babbling about the whispers, the footsteps, the power outages. They were skeptical, but concerned, thinking I had let my imagination get the better of me. We checked the house together, but found nothing unusual. No signs of forced entry, no disturbances. It was as if everything had been a figment of my imagination. But I knew what I had heard and felt. I knew I wasn't alone in that house. To this day, I can't explain what happened during those 2 nights. I haven't stayed home alone since, and every creak and whisper still sends a chill down my spine. Whatever it was, it felt like a warning, a reminder that we are never truly alone. And sometimes, the things that go bump in the night are all too real.
I never thought I'd be the one to write about a disturbing Home Alone horror story, but here I am, documenting the most terrifying weekend of my life. As an author, my imagination has always been my greatest tool, but nothing could have prepared me for what I experienced in my father's cabin in Blackwood Forest. It was supposed to be a weekend of solitude, inspiration, and productivity. My latest book was due in a few months, and I desperately needed to get away from the distractions of city life. My father's old cabin seemed perfect, a remote sanctuary deep in Blackwood Forest, surrounded by the thick, ancient woods of Pennsylvania. He hadn't used it in years, and it was the perfect spot for an undisturbed writing session. I arrived on Friday afternoon, the sky already darkening with the promise of a storm. The cabin was exactly as I remembered. A quaint wooden structure nestled among towering pines, with a small porch and a single dim light that flickered intermittently. I unpacked my bags, stocked the fridge with enough food and beer to last the weekend, and set up my laptop on the old wooden desk by the window. By the time night fell, the storm had arrived in full force. Thunder rumbled through the forest, and rain pounded against the roof and windows. It was the perfect backdrop for writing horror. I cracked open a beer, took a few hits from my joint, and began to write. Hours passed in a haze of creativity and inebriation. I was lost in my own world, the storm outside only adding to the eerie atmosphere of my story. It was around midnight when I first noticed something strange. During a particularly loud crack of thunder, a flash of lightning illuminated the window next to my desk. For a split second, I saw a figure standing just outside, at the edge of the tree line. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. The figure was gone as quickly as it had appeared, but the image was burned into my mind. A tall, dark silhouette, distinctly non-human, with glowing eyes that seemed to stare straight at me. I shook my head, trying to dispel the creeping unease. It was just my imagination, I told myself, a trick of the light and my overactive writer's mind. I took another swig of beer and tried to refocus on my work, but the unease wouldn't go away. Every flash of lightning seemed to bring that figure closer. I could feel its presence, a malevolent aura that pressed in on me from all sides. The storm raged on, and the cabin creaked and groaned as if it were alive. I finally decided to call it a night. I shut down my laptop and headed to the bedroom, leaving the lights on as I went. The sense of being watched was overwhelming, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just outside. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rain hammering against the roof. Sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing eyes, felt that intense, unblinking gaze. Then, just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it, a scratching sound, faint but persistent, coming from above. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened. The sound grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from the roof. I grabbed the flashlight from my bedside table and crept out of the bedroom. The scratching continued, now accompanied by a low, growling noise that set my teeth on edge. I shone the flashlight up at the ceiling, following the sound to the living room. A sudden, deafening crash made me jump. The sound of splintering wood echoed through the cabin, and I swung the flashlight beam wildly, trying to find the source. My heart was in my throat as I saw a section of the roof had caved in, and something was moving in the shadows. I backed away slowly, flashlight shaking in my hand. The growling grew louder, more guttural. I caught a glimpse of fur and claws, and then it stepped into the light. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before. It was a wolf, but not like any wolf I'd ever encountered. It was larger, more menacing, with matted fur and eyes that glowed with a sickly yellow light. Its mouth was filled with rows of sharp, jagged teeth, and its breath came in ragged, hissing gasps. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I turned and ran, sprinting for the front door. The creature let out a bone-chilling howl and lunged after me. I could hear its claws scraping against the wooden floor, its breath hot on my heels. I threw open the door and ran into the storm, the rain blinding me as I made a beeline for my car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking uncontrollably. Behind me, I heard the creature crashing through the doorway, its growls growing louder. Finally, I managed to unlock the car and threw myself inside, slamming the door shut just as the creature reached me. I jammed the key into the ignition and started the engine, peeling out of the driveway without a second thought. As I sped down the narrow, winding road away from the cabin, I glanced in the rearview mirror. There it was, standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by my taillights. The wolf-like creature stared after me, its glowing eyes burning into my soul. But it wasn't just a wolf. I knew that much. The way it had moved, the intelligence in its gaze, this was something else, something far more sinister. It had gotten into the cabin through the roof, defying logic and nature. It wasn't a creature of this world. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town, my hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel. I parked outside a 24-hour diner and sat there shaking and soaked to the bone, trying to process what had just happened. I called my dad the next morning, telling him everything. He listened in stunned silence, then told me he'd sell the place. I never went back, and I never wrote about it, until now. I sold the cabin a few weeks later, not caring about the loss. I just wanted to be rid of it, to forget about that terrifying weekend in Blackwood Forest. But I can't forget. The memory of those glowing eyes and the sound of its growls still haunt me. So here it is, my disturbing true Home Alone horror story. Believe it or not, this is what happened. And if you ever find yourself alone in a remote cabin during a storm, beware. You never know what might be lurking just outside. Watching, waiting for the right moment to strike.
I took the babysitting job on a whim. It seemed like an easy way to make some extra cash over the summer. And besides, how hard could it be? The kid was 4 years old, a little girl named Emily who spent most of her time playing with her toys or watching cartoons. The parents were nice enough, giving me a rundown of Emily's bedtime routine and leaving me with their contact information in case of an emergency. They seemed relieved to have found a babysitter on such short notice, mentioning something about a last-minute work event they had to attend. As the sun began to set and the parents headed out the door, I settled in for what I thought would be a quiet night. Emily was already in her pajamas, clutching her favorite stuffed animal as she watched her cartoons on the TV. I sat on the couch, scrolling through my phone and occasionally glancing over at Emily to make sure she was okay. But as the night wore on, strange things started happening. It started with a faint tapping sound coming from outside, like someone gently rapping on the window. I brushed it off as the wind or maybe a tree branch, but the sound persisted, growing louder and more insistent with each passing minute. I glanced out the window, expecting to see a stray cat or maybe a raccoon, but the yard was empty, bathed in the soft glow of the streetlights. I shivered, a sudden chill running down my spine, and I made a mental note to close the windows before I went to bed. But as I got up to do just that, something caught my eye. A figure standing in the shadows at the edge of the yard. It was a woman, her long hair blowing in the breeze, her eyes fixed on me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, as she waved at me with a smile that sent chills down my spine. I quickly closed the windows and locked the doors, my hands shaking as I tried to steady my nerves. I told myself it was just my imagination, that there was nothing to be afraid of, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I checked on Emily, finding her fast asleep in her bed, her stuffed animal clutched tightly in her arms. I sighed with relief, grateful that she was safe and sound, but my unease only grew as I made my way back downstairs. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of the back door opening. My blood turned to ice as I realized I had forgotten to lock it. I cursed myself for being so careless, my mind racing with fear as I tried to think of what to do next. I grabbed Emily from her bed, holding her close as I crept through the darkened house. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a thunderclap in the silence, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I made a split-second decision to hide in the attic, hoping that whoever was in the house wouldn't think to look there. I pulled down the ladder and climbed up, Emily clinging to me as we huddled together in the darkness. I reached for my phone, intending to call the police, but my heart sank as I realized the battery was nearly dead. I had left my charger downstairs, and there was no way I could make it back without being seen. But I had to try. I had to do everything in my power to protect Emily and myself from whatever was lurking in the shadows below. I took a deep breath and made a run for it, my footsteps slow and deliberate as I descended the stairs. Every creak of the floorboards felt like a gunshot in the silence, and I prayed that whoever was in the house wouldn't hear me. I reached the bottom of the stairs and grabbed my charger, my heart pounding in my chest as I turned to head back upstairs. But before I could take a single step, I heard it. The sound of footsteps echoing through the hallway. I froze, my blood turning to ice as I realized the intruder was right behind me. I turned and ran, my heart racing as I raced up the stairs and into the attic, slamming the door shut behind me. I fumbled with my phone, my hands shaking as I tried to dial 911. The screen flickered to life, the battery dangerously low as I punched in the numbers. I held my breath as the call connected, praying that help would arrive in time. But as I spoke to the dispatcher, I heard a loud crash from below, the sound of someone trying to break down the attic door. My heart raced as I pressed myself against the wall, my mind racing with fear as I waited for the police to arrive. Minutes felt like hours as I listened to the sound of the intruder's attempts to break through the door. But just as I was about to lose hope, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance, the unmistakable sound of police cars racing towards the house. Relief flooded through me as I heard the attic door being kicked in, followed by the sound of voices shouting commands. I opened the door and peered out, my heart pounding in my chest as I saw the police officers standing in the hallway, their guns drawn. They searched the house from top to bottom, but there was no sign of the intruder. It was as if she had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only a trail of destruction and fear. But as the police combed through the house, they made a chilling discovery, a photo of the intruder. They found out that she had escaped from a nearby psychiatric hospital earlier that night, and it seemed she had been on a mission to find her next victims. Thankfully, Emily and I were safe, but the experience left me with a deep sense of paranoia and fear. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. As I sit here now, writing this story, I can't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see her standing there, her eyes fixed on me with that same chilling smile. And though I know it's unlikely, I can't shake the feeling that she's still out there, waiting, watching, biding her time until she can strike again.
I grew up in a small town where nothing much ever happened. My father, a dedicated musician, rarely left his studio, except for the occasional gig or meeting with potential collaborators. He poured his heart and soul into his work, often neglecting everything else, including me. But when he finally announced he had a date, I was surprised and excited. It was a rare occasion for him to take time for himself, and it meant I had the house to myself, an opportunity I seldom enjoyed. He gave me the usual rundown of do's and don'ts, reminding me to lock the doors and stay inside. He kissed my forehead, a rare show of affection, before he left, the sound of his car fading into the night. I was 17, old enough to handle a few hours alone, and eager to use the time to indulge in my favorite pastime, playing the guitar and painting. I had a fresh canvas, a new set of paints, and a stash of weed that I had been saving for just such an occasion. I set up my easel in the living room, turned on some music, and lit up. The house was quiet, save for the soft hum of my favorite playlist, and I felt a sense of peace and freedom that was hard to come by. About an hour into my session, just as I was getting lost in the colors and patterns on the canvas, I heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible snicker. I paused, the paintbrush hovering in midair. I strained to listen, but the house was silent again. I shrugged it off as my imagination, or maybe the weed playing tricks on my mind, and went back to painting. A few minutes later, I heard it again, louder this time and unmistakably real. I muted the music, my heart starting to race. The snickering seemed to come from the direction of the basement. My mind raced through the possibilities. Maybe it was a rodent or the old pipes making strange noises. But deep down, I knew it wasn't either of those things. I grabbed my phone, but calling my father wasn't an option. He never answered when he was on a date. I considered calling the police, but hesitated, not wanting to overreact. Instead, I decided to investigate. I picked up a heavy metal rod from the fireplace, its weight comforting in my hand. The snickering turned into low, guttural chuckles as I approached the basement door. My palms were sweaty, and my breath came in shallow gasps. I inched forward. As I reached the basement doorway, I peeked around the corner, my heart pounding in my ears. The basement was dark, but the door was slightly ajar, a sliver of light spilling into the darkness. The chuckling stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I slowly opened the door, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness below. Suddenly, a figure darted past the beam of light, and I screamed. Stumbling backward, the flashlight clattered to the floor, its beam spinning wildly. I scrambled to pick it up, my hands shaking uncontrollably. When I finally managed to steady the light, the figure was gone. I slammed the basement door shut and locked it, my mind racing with fear. Who was down there? Why were they laughing? I needed to call the police. I ran back to the living room and grabbed my phone, dialing 911 with trembling fingers.
911, what's your emergency?
The operator asked. There's someone in my basement, I whispered, my voice shaking. I think they're trying to get in.
Stay calm, sir. What's your address?
I gave the operator my address, and she assured me that officers were on their way. I stayed on the line, trying to control my breathing. The operator kept talking to me, her voice a lifeline in the darkness. A loud bang echoed through the house, and I screamed again. It came from the basement. The operator heard it too.
Stay on the line,
she instructed.
Officers are en route.
I grabbed the metal rod and crept towards the basement door. It was ajar again, the darkness beyond it yawning like a mouth. I had never been more terrified in my life, but I had to know what was down there. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended into the basement. The air was cold and damp, the smell of mildew strong. The flashlight's beam cut through the gloom, revealing old furniture and boxes stacked haphazardly. I moved slowly, every nerve in my body on edge. Then I saw it, a pair of glowing eyes staring at me from the far corner of the basement. I froze, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The eyes blinked, and a low chuckle filled the air. I took a step back, my foot catching on a loose floorboard. I fell, the flashlight skidding across the floor and going out. In the pitch darkness, the chuckling grew louder, closer. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers numb with fear. I managed to turn on the flashlight, the dim light revealing the figure standing over me. It was a man, his face twisted into a grotesque grin, his eyes wide and unblinking. He lunged at me and I screamed, kicking out with all my strength. My foot connected with his knee and he stumbled, giving me a chance to scramble to my feet. I ran up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind me. I heard the sound of sirens approaching, a wave of relief washing over me. I ran to the front door and flung it open just as the police car pulled into the driveway. 2 officers got out, their faces serious as they approached. "He's in the basement," I cried, pointing towards the door. The officers drew their guns and headed inside, one of them staying with me to take my statement. I could hear them shouting commands as they descended into the basement, followed by the sounds of a struggle. Minutes later, they emerged with the man in handcuffs. His face was twisted into that same grotesque grin, his eyes locked onto mine. He laughed, a chilling sound that echoed in my mind long after he was taken away. The police searched the basement and found a makeshift bed, empty food wrappers, and a collection of knives. He had been living there for weeks, watching us, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. My father came home shortly after, his face pale with worry. He hugged me tightly, his hands shaking. We moved out of that house the next day, unable to stay in a place that had been violated in such a horrific way. I still have nightmares about that night. I can still hear his laughter, still see his eyes staring at me from the darkness. I don't think I'll ever feel safe again. Not completely. But I survived. And for that, I am grateful. The man was identified as a drifter with a long history of mental illness and violence. He had been living in our basement, undetected, for months. He was deemed criminally insane and was locked up in a high-security mental institution. But sometimes late at night, I think I can still hear his laughter, echoing in the corners of my mind, reminding me that true horror isn't found in movies or books. It's lurking in the shadows of our everyday lives, waiting for the perfect moment to strike.
I never considered myself a fearful person. After all, I'm a grown man with a family and responsibilities. Yet there are moments when even the bravest among us are forced to confront the inexplicable. This story, however, isn't about bravery. It's about a night that made me question everything I thought I knew about reality. It was a cold winter evening, and my wife Sarah and our 2 kids had left to visit her parents for the weekend. I had planned to join them, but work commitments held me back. Our house, a modern open-floor plan home, felt spacious yet comforting when it was filled with the laughter and chaos of our children. Alone, though, it seemed too large, too empty. I decided to take advantage of the rare solitude to catch up on some much-needed rest and relaxation. After a long day at work, I settled into the living room to watch some TV. The open layout of the house meant that while I sat on the couch, I had a clear view of the kitchen, dining area, and the staircase leading upstairs. But it also meant that my back was exposed to the vast, dark expanse of the house. An arrangement that, for some reason, made me feel slightly on edge. It started subtly. I was halfway through Die Hard, one of my favorite movies, when I thought I heard a faint creak from upstairs. I paused the movie and listened intently. Nothing. Just the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock on the wall. Shaking off the unease, I resumed watching, convincing myself it was just the house settling. But the feeling persisted. I couldn't shake the sense of being watched. Every creak, every rustle seemed amplified in the silence. It was as if the house was breathing, alive in a way I had never noticed before. I laughed at myself, calling myself paranoid. I decided to make some tea, hoping a warm drink would calm my nerves. As I stood in the kitchen waiting for the kettle to boil, I heard it again, a distinct, soft thud from upstairs. This time it was unmistakable. My heart rate quickened, and I felt a bead of sweat trickle down my temple, despite the cold. I grabbed a flashlight from the drawer, its solid weight comforting in my hand, and headed towards the staircase. I ascended the stairs slowly, my ears straining for any sound. When I reached the top, I turned on the hallway light. The rooms were just as we had left them. The kids' toys were neatly stored in their bins, and the doors to the bedrooms were slightly ajar. I checked each room methodically, starting with the master bedroom. Nothing seemed out of place. The last room to check was the guest bedroom. As I pushed open the door, the air felt colder, denser. I scanned the room with my flashlight and my heart nearly stopped. The closet door was slightly open, a sliver of darkness peeking through. I distinctly remembered closing it the last time I was in there. I approached the closet, each step feeling heavier than the last. With a deep breath, I yanked the door open, flashlight in hand, ready to confront whatever was inside. But there was nothing, just our old winter coats and a few storage boxes. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding and laughed nervously at my own paranoia. Back downstairs, I tried to immerse myself in the movie again, but the sense of unease lingered. The house felt different, charged with an unfamiliar energy. It was then that I noticed something even more unsettling. The family photo on the mantelpiece was tilted. I knew for a fact it had been perfectly straight when I last looked at it. Feeling a chill run down my spine, I straightened the photo and sat back down. The room felt colder now, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more frequently. The sense of being watched had intensified, as if unseen eyes were tracking my every move. Then the power went out. The TV blinked off, plunging the house into darkness. I sat there, frozen for a moment, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The flashlight was still in my hand, and I fumbled to turn it on. The beam cut through the darkness, and I made my way to the circuit breaker in the basement. As I descended the stairs to the basement, the air grew colder. The beam of the flashlight flickered, and I cursed under my breath. The basement was a place I rarely visited. Sarah handled most of the household chores, including laundry. The unfamiliarity of the space only added to my growing dread. I reached the circuit breaker and flipped the main switch. The lights came back on, and I let out a sigh of relief. As I turned to head back upstairs, something caught my eye. A shadow, quick and darting, disappearing behind the water heater. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly approached. The flashlight held out in front of me like a weapon. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. Silence. I peered behind the water heater, but there was nothing, no sign of anyone or anything. My mind raced with possibilities. An animal, a trick of the light, or worse, an intruder. I quickly made my way back upstairs, double-checking that all doors and windows were locked. Back in the living room, I tried to calm myself. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the house's unfamiliar noises were playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I decided to call Sarah, needing to hear her voice. She answered on the third ring, her voice warm and familiar. "Hey, honey, how's everything?" "Fine," I lied, not wanting to worry her. "Just wanted to hear your voice." "Miss you too," she said. "We'll be back in a couple of days." We talked for a few more minutes before saying our goodbyes. Hearing her voice calmed me somewhat, but the sense of unease lingered. I decided to turn in early, hoping sleep would come quickly and banish my irrational fears. I locked the bedroom door and climbed into bed, leaving the bedside lamp on. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I heard it again. A soft thud, this time followed by a faint scratching sound. It seemed to be coming from the attic, directly above my bedroom. I debated whether to investigate or try to ignore it. My curiosity got the better of me, and I grabbed the flashlight once more. The entrance to the attic was in the hallway, a pull-down ladder that creaked loudly as I extended it. I climbed up, the flashlight's beam cutting through the darkness. The attic was cold and filled with the smell of old wood and dust. I scanned the space, my breath visible in the frigid air. At first, everything seemed normal, just old boxes and holiday decorations. But then, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In the dust on the floor, there were footprints, small, childlike footprints, leading towards the far corner of the attic. I followed them, my heart pounding in my chest. The footprints led to an old, dusty trunk. I hesitated, my hand trembling as I reached for the lid. With a deep breath, I opened it. The trunk was empty, save for a single old-fashioned doll. Its glass eyes stared up at me, and a sense of dread washed over me. Suddenly, the attic door slammed shut, plunging me into darkness. I dropped the flashlight and it rolled away, its beam casting eerie shadows on the walls. Panic set in as I scrambled to find it. When I finally grabbed it and turned the beam back on, I saw them. Figures, small and childlike, standing just at the edge of the light. I stumbled back, my heart racing. The figures moved closer, their features becoming clearer. They were children, but their eyes were hollow, dark voids that seemed to suck in the light. They reached out to me, their hands cold as ice. "No," I screamed, backing away. "This can't be real." I felt a hand on my shoulder and whipped around, swinging the flashlight. It connected with something solid, and I heard a grunt. The figures vanished, and I was alone in the attic once more. I raced down the ladder, slamming the attic door behind me. Back in my bedroom, I locked the door and sat on the bed, trying to calm my racing heart. The lamp flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck and turned, but there was nothing there. I knew then that I wasn't alone in the house. Whatever was here, it was playing with me, feeding on my fear. I had to get out, but my legs felt like lead. I reached for my phone, but it was dead, the battery inexplicably drained. Desperation set in. I grabbed my car keys and made my way to the front door, my heart pounding in my chest. As I reached for the doorknob, the lights flickered and went out again, plunging the house into darkness. I fumbled with the lock, my hands shaking, when I heard a voice, soft, childlike, and coming from right behind me. "Stay with us, Daddy." I spun around, my back against the door. The figures were there, their hollow eyes staring at me. I fumbled with the lock, finally wrenching the door open and stumbling outside. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I jumped in, locking the doors and starting the engine. As I sped away from the house, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw them, standing on the porch, watching me with those empty eyes. I drove straight to a hotel, my mind racing. I spent the night there, unable to sleep, my thoughts consumed by the events of the night. The next morning, I returned to the house with a sense of dread. It was quiet, peaceful even, the events of the previous night feeling like a distant nightmare. I called a priest to bless the house, hoping it would bring some sense of peace. Sarah and the kids returned the next day, and I didn't tell them what had happened. I couldn't. How could I explain something so bizarre, so terrifying? Months passed, and the fear gradually faded, but I never forgot. Even now, years later, I still feel uneasy in that house, especially at night. The memory of those hollow eyes haunts me, a reminder that there are things in this world we cannot explain. Even though the rational part of me wants to dismiss it all as a nightmare or a trick of my mind, I can't shake the feeling that something very real and very dark brushed against my life that night. I share this story not to seek attention or sympathy, but as a caution. Sometimes the things we think we know about the safety of our homes and the comfort of solitude are nothing but illusions. So the next time you're alone and feel a chill that shouldn't be there, or hear a sound that doesn't belong, listen to your instincts. Sometimes it's not just the house settling. Sometimes it's something else entirely.
I never thought I'd be writing about this, let alone reliving that night, but I need to get it off my chest, to put my fears into words, and maybe, just maybe, find some semblance of peace. My name is Lana, and I'm a 28-year-old English teacher living alone in the city. What happened to me that night has haunted me for years, and though I try to rationalize it, I can't shake the feeling that it was all too real. It was a Friday night, and I had just returned home from a particularly long day at school. The students were restless, the grading was overwhelming, and I was looking forward to a quiet evening with a good book. I lived in a modest apartment, cozy but lonely. My work consumed most of my time, and though I had friends, I often found solace in my solitude. I had just settled into my favorite chair with a cup of tea when there was a knock at the door. It was odd. No one ever visited me without calling first. I hesitated, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. Another knock, this time more insistent. I placed my cup down and approached the door, peering through the peephole. A man stood there, tall and thin, with an unsettling aura about him. His eyes were dark, almost black, and his smile sent a shiver down my spine. "Who is it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just a visitor," he replied, his voice smooth and cold. Against my better judgment, I opened the door. Something about him was compelling, almost hypnotic. As soon as the door was open, he stepped inside, uninvited. My breath hitched, and I instinctively stepped back. "I'm here for a visit, Lana," he said, closing the door behind him. "Just a little visit." "How do you know my name?" I demanded, my voice trembling. He didn't answer, just stared at me with those unnerving eyes. "Please sit down." He gestured to the chair. Against my will, I found myself obeying. It was as if his words had a power over me, a pull I couldn't resist. I sat, my body rigid, my mind screaming to run, but I couldn't move. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. He smiled, a chilling, predatory smile. "Think of me as an old friend. I've come to visit my meal." My heart pounded in my chest. "Your meal?" "Yes, Lana. You see, in the afterlife, you will be mine. I like to visit my meals before they become mine. It adds a certain flavor to their souls." Fear gripped me, cold and unrelenting. "What do you mean? I don't understand." "You will in time," he said, his voice a dark caress. "I enjoy fear, Lana. It makes the soul taste better. And your fear, it's delicious." I tried to move, to scream, but his words held me captive. I was trapped in my own body, unable to do anything but listen. He leaned closer, his presence overwhelming, suffocating. The room seemed to darken, the shadows deepening, wrapping around me like a shroud. "You feel it, don't you?" he whispered. "The darkness, the helplessness. You're mine, Lana. You've always been mine." Tears streamed down my face, but I couldn't wipe them away. His words had me ensnared, trapped in a web of dread and despair. It was as if I was sinking into an endless black hole, the darkness consuming me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My mind was a fog of terror, his voice the only thing I could focus on. "Cry if you want," he said, his tone almost gentle. "It makes it sweeter. Your tears, your fear, they're all part of the feast." I sobbed, the realization hitting me with a force that stole my breath. I was his. There was no escape, no hope. Just an eternity of darkness and fear. "Why are you doing this?" I choked out, my voice barely more than a whisper. "Because I can," he replied simply. "Because it's what I do. And you, Lana, are a particularly delightful meal." He stood, his presence looming over me like a dark cloud. "I'll be back for you when the time comes. Until then, Remember this night. Remember the fear, the helplessness. It will make our reunion all the more satisfying." He turned and walked to the door. As he opened it, he looked back at me, his eyes gleaming with a malevolent light. "Good night, Lana. Sleep well." With that, he was gone. The door clicked shut behind him, and I was left alone in the darkness. I felt a strange sense of release, as if a spell had been broken. My body trembled uncontrollably, the tears still streaming down my face. I could move again, but all I could do was curl into a ball on the chair, my mind reeling from what had just happened. I must have fallen asleep at some point because I woke up drenched in sweat, the memory of the encounter vivid in my mind. It took me a moment to realize I was still in my chair, the room bathed in the dim light of the early morning. I shivered, the fear from the night before still clinging to me like a second skin. It had to have been a nightmare, I told myself, a vivid, horrifying nightmare. But as I stood and made my way to the kitchen, I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been real. I needed light, something to dispel the lingering shadows. I turned on the TV, hoping for some mindless noise to drown out the echoes of his voice in my head. The news was on, a local broadcast. I watched in a daze, not really paying attention until the anchor said something that made my blood run cold. "And let Lana know that she will be his feast in the afterlife," the anchor said, his tone casual, as if he was delivering the weather forecast. "And now, let's go to John with sports." I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. Did I really just hear that? Or was it my exhausted, terror-addled mind playing tricks on me? I turned off the TV, the silence in the apartment deafening. That night, that voice, it never left me. For years I lived in fear, jumping at shadows, dreading the quiet of my own home. I tried to move on, to forget, but it was always there, lurking at the edges of my mind. And now I'm writing this, hoping that by putting it into words, I can finally exorcise the demon that has haunted me for so long. Was it real? Was it a dream? I don't know. But I do know that the fear was real, and it's a fear that I've carried with me ever since that night. If you're reading this, know that I'm not crazy. Know that there are things out there, in the darkness, that we can't understand. And if you ever hear a knock at your door at an odd hour, think twice before opening it.
I was 14, and I had the house to myself. My parents and younger sister had gone to the mall for a late-night shopping spree, and I'd opted to stay behind and play video games. It was a win-win. They got their shopping done without me whining about how long they were taking, and I got to spend a few uninterrupted hours leveling up in my favorite game. The house was quiet, save for the sounds of my game. Our neighborhood was pretty safe, so I wasn't worried about being alone. I was in the zone, completely absorbed in my game, when I heard the first noise. It was a soft creak, like someone had stepped on an old floorboard. I paused the game, straining to listen. Nothing. I shook it off, attributing it to the house settling, or maybe even our cat, Smokey, who was known for his stealthy prowling. I unpaused the game and continued playing, but the noise nagged at me. About 20 minutes later, I heard it again, louder this time, coming from upstairs. My heart started to race a bit. Smokey was curled up on the couch next to me, so it couldn't have been him. Curiosity and a tinge of fear propelled me to investigate. I grabbed the baseball bat from the hall closet and crept up the stairs, each step careful and measured. I reached the top and peered down the hallway. All the doors were closed, just as we'd left them. I listened for a moment, but all I could hear was the soft hum of the refrigerator downstairs. Feeling slightly foolish, I turned to head back down. Then I heard it. A distinct, deliberate knock on the door to my parents' bedroom. My heart leapt into my throat. The knocking continued, slow and rhythmic. I clenched the bat tighter, Inching my way down the hall, my hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. Taking a deep breath, I threw the door open, bat raised. The room was empty. The window was closed, the bed made, everything in its place. My pulse pounded in my ears as I scanned the room, expecting something or someone to leap out at me. But there was nothing. I backed out of the room, shutting the door behind me, and hurried back downstairs. I tried to rationalize the noise. Maybe it was just the house settling. Maybe there was a logical explanation. But my mind kept drifting back to that knock. I returned to my game, but my focus was shot. Every creak and groan of the house set me on edge. Smokey, sensing my unease, hopped into my lap, purring softly. His presence was comforting, but my nerves were still frayed. Another hour passed, and I was starting to relax again when I heard footsteps. Clear, unmistakable footsteps, descending the stairs. My breath caught in my throat. I muted the TV, straining to hear. The footsteps paused, then continued, methodical and slow. I grabbed my phone and texted my mom, asking when they'd be home. No response. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I stood, holding the bat like a lifeline. My eyes darted around the room, looking for an escape. The back door was locked, the windows bolted shut. I was trapped. The footsteps stopped just outside the living room. The air felt thick, suffocating. I held my breath, waiting. Then the doorknob turned. I tensed, muscles coiled, ready to swing the bat with all my might. The door creaked open, revealing nothing. The hallway was empty. I let out a shaky breath, inching towards the door. My hand was slick with sweat as I gripped the bat. I peeked into the hallway, half expecting to see some grotesque figure standing there. But there was nothing. Just an empty hall. I backed into the living room, never taking my eyes off the doorway. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Maybe I was imagining things, maybe it was all in my head. But the fear felt real, tangible. Then out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A shadow flickered across the wall, quick and fleeting. I spun around, but again there was nothing. I was starting to feel like I was losing my mind. I considered calling the police, but what would I say? That I was scared of shadows and noises. Desperate for a distraction, I turned the TV back on, hoping the noise would drown out my fear. I sat back down, trying to lose myself in the game. But my concentration was shattered, every nerve in my body on high alert. Then the power went out. The TV screen flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled for my phone, turning on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, casting long, eerie shadows. I heard a faint whisper, so quiet I almost missed it. My name. Someone or something was whispering my name. John. I whipped around, the flashlight beam dancing across the walls. The whisper came again, closer this time. John. My heart pounded in my chest as I moved towards the source of the sound. The whispers led me to the basement door, slightly ajar. The air was colder here, a chill seeping through the cracks. I didn't want to go down there, but I had to know what was happening. I nudged the door open with the bat, the hinges creaking loudly. The basement was pitch black, the narrow beam of my flashlight barely penetrating the gloom. I descended the stairs, each step a fresh wave of terror. At the bottom, the whispering stopped. I swept the flashlight across the room, revealing nothing but old furniture and boxes. My shoulders sagged with relief, and I turned to head back up. Then something grabbed my ankle. I screamed, dropping the flashlight. I kicked wildly, breaking free of the cold grip. I scrambled up the stairs, heart in my throat. I burst into the living room, slamming the basement door shut behind me. I could still feel the icy fingers on my skin, the whispering echoing in my ears. I didn't know what to do. I felt trapped, helpless. Then I heard the front door open. I spun around, hope flaring in my chest. My mom walked in, bags in hand, my sister trailing behind her. Relief washed over me, and I dropped the bat, running to hug her. "What's wrong, John?" she asked with concern in her eyes. I tried to explain, but the words tumbled out incoherently. I took a deep breath, trying to calm down. I told her about the noises, the footsteps, the whispering. She listened, her expression shifting from concern to something else. Skepticism, maybe. She assured me it was probably just my imagination, that I'd scared myself being alone in the house. But I knew what I'd heard, what I'd felt. My dad checked the basement, finding nothing unusual. They chalked it up to the house's age, to creaky floorboards and drafts. I wanted to believe them, but that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Smokey curled up next to me, a comforting presence in the darkness. I eventually fell into a restless sleep, haunted by whispers and shadows. The next morning, things seemed normal. The sun was shining, the house was warm, and the events of the previous night felt like a bad dream. But every so often I'd catch a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye, or hear a faint creak that set my nerves on edge. I never told my friends about that night, and my family never brought it up again. But every time I'm alone in the house, I can't help but feel that chill, that sense of unease. I always keep a light on now, and I never, ever go into the basement.